Welcome to Fuse, the global podcast for the PRCA. In this podcast, we explore the evolving landscape of global communications. We bring together leaders from public relations, politics, business, and academia, as well as media, to spark new ideas and ignite innovation. Welcome, Rupert.
Nice to see you, Farzana.
So a little bit about Rupert Younger. Rupert Younger is the founder and director of the Oxford University Centre for Corporate Reputation. He's also the chair of the Enacting Purpose Initiative, a multi-institution partnership, a leading commentator on reputation matters relating to corporations and institutions worldwide. He has published 2 books. The Reputation Game, which I'm currently listening to on Spotify, is an international bestseller published in 7 languages, and also the Activist Manifesto, published in 2 languages. He's also the academic director for Oxford's Corporate Affairs Academy. Welcome, Rupert. So I wanted to start off with getting to know a little bit about your life. So I know it must vary from day to day, but could you talk us through a typical day in your life?
Typical day. Lovely to see you, Farzana, and thank you for having me on the podcast. I guess in as much as there's any typicality, I'm an early bird. So I'm always up pretty early.
How early?
Well, sort of 6-ish. Maybe that's not that early, but 6-ish. And I find that I can write more clearly early rather than late. That's partly because we're all inundated with emails and everything else, and that takes your mind away from what you're trying to focus on. But also, I just find I'm fresher in the morning. And so I guess if there's any typicality, I tend to get up. I tend to either write or read with a bit of clarity. Then if I'm traveling, I will travel to wherever I've got to go, have meetings for the day. The Oxford role that I have means that I have certain blocks of time in the year where I'm teaching either the MBA or executive programs, and those will dictate in a formal sense my sort of pattern, if you like, of daily activity. So when I'm doing, when I have teaching commitments, they are set in stone. Outside of that, I can kind of be kind of where I want to be within reason. So I do a bit of travel. I spend a lot of my time trying to meet and talk to people to learn things about the subject that I'm so interested in. That's my typical day.
And you're no longer in agency land. So does that mean that you're not sort of constantly scanning the news? How do you consume news?
I think once you've been in our industry, you just consume avidly news. So I still like reading the news in a physical format. We're all inundated with all the online, and so you get fed all the information, of course. But I find that physical newspapers help you to decode what the journalistic community regards as more important. So the position of a story on the page, the prominence of the story in the paper, I find that's kind of helpful, especially when there's so much that you can consume every day.
What do you read?
I try and read things that make me feel comfortable and things that make me feel definitely uncomfortable. So I try and challenge myself to read publications that I find detestable, as well as publications that I find reassuring.
So I think that's brilliant that you actually read across spectrums, those sort of outlets that you find yourself agreeing with, as well as those that you find yourself in opposition to. Because actually, I think society is becoming quite polarized, and part of it is because actually the algorithms that we consume our news, if we're sort of reading online, it ends up sort of just giving us more of what we actually believe in and agree with. So I think that's a wonderful approach to consuming news. Now, you've obviously had an incredible journey from being, an author, founding one of the leading agencies in the world, setting up this incredible centre at Oxford. What would you say is your professional mission in life? What drives you? What underpins all these different aspects, across your sort of journey, which we'll obviously go into next?
That's a great question. I guess the thing that I'm most interested in, if that's the way I can interpret your question,
Yeah.
is to find ways to help us to all understand each other better as human beings. I find that it's both super energizing when people who don't know each other can come together and find common ground. I
Mm.
like that process. I also find it um, both annoying and distressing to see people yelling at each other and shouting and being on transmit the whole time. So I guess I've sort of found a niche in communications and in the work that I'm doing of trying to find ways to help bring people together. So if there was one thing that I think defines me, it's probably that.
So it's sort of building bridges between people, organizations, institutions.
Yeah, it's so important today. I mean, I think it's always been important, and certainly the work I've done researching reputation over millennia shows that this has always been important.
Yeah.
But you can only do things in the age that you're born into, and we happen to be born into an age where there seems to be a lot of polarization happening, and that's been supercharged by social media and by the online forums that exist. So I think it's an imperative to find ways to help us to all understand each other and listen to each other's points of view, and to find ways for respectful dialogue. I mean, that's, I suppose, why I have found a natural home in a university, because that's what universities are supposed to be about, which is the ability for people to be able to speak without fear or favor, whether you're an academic or whether you're a student.
That's quite an interesting comment because you often see in the news universities like Oxford with sort of in the middle of these culture wars of cancel culture. And so, I always, sort of grew up thinking university is actually where you go to be challenged. What are your thoughts on that aspect where,
Yeah, I think it's a very, very big question for universities. I mean, I think you're right that universities should be anchored in this idea of being a place where you should be able to express whatever view you want, as
yeah,
long as it's done in a respectful way, and you should be allowed to be heard. It's the entire purpose of the debating chambers. It's the entire purpose, I argue, of the classrooms that we're in. Um, it's a sad feature, I think, again, because of this polarization, that presumption is being challenged at universities. And now this right to be offended, that's the sort of way I describe it, is that there seems to be emerging a right to be offended at universities. And I just find that a very odd concept, because the whole point about coming to university or any college or any further education is that you should be able to join in conversations which you profoundly disagree with. And you should sit and try and understand other points of view and find ways to encapsulate the arguments that you want to put against it or for it. But I think you're right, that's under challenge. And it's under challenge from this polarization that exists everywhere in our societies. And it's incumbent on us as universities, I think, to try and make sure that respectful dialogue is encouraged and constructed too, as well, so that we don't have physical interference with debates, discussions as well. Universities need to be very vigilant about that.
and do you think there's a connection between the sort of the generation in terms of the students who find it difficult to hear people who have opposing views and want speakers cancelled, and the fact that they've been sort of brought up with social media that has those sort of algorithms that really tune in sort of content that they naturally feel comfortable consuming and then shutting out content that they don't. Do you think that has something to do with it?
I'm sure it must do. I mean, I think probably the issue of ignorant certainty, the idea that you are certain of your own views irrespective of the rest of the world,
Mm.
that's an age old concept. I think people have existed in ignorant certainty and in network bubbles forever. But the nature of our connectivity today, because of social media, because of essentially since 2000, we've all had broadband availability. I mean, it's not long ago that it was hard to download anything or upload anything on, or indeed see anything online. Now, of course, we can see everything instantly. And the algorithms, exactly as you've said, are constructed in a way that we get fed things that we seem to like. And so that idea of increasing ignorant certainty seems to be a particular risk with social media. And I'm sure you're right that the problems we see today are certainly exacerbated, if not accelerated, by social media.
It's a fascinating topic, and I think worthy of its own podcast conversation. Now, you started off yourself at university, it's Aberdeen, and you studied economics and international relations. So I'm always intrigued to know from so many people sort of start off learning a completely different subject matter and then end up in the world of strategic communications. How did you segue from economics and international relations into our world?
Well, probably like most people who go to university, I wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to study. But I'd done an economics A level, and I felt that economics was something that was important to understand. You know,
Yeah.
how and why people are motivated to do things, and the structures around that seemed to me to be an important subject. So I studied that. But to be honest with you, I found the international relations side far more interesting, and I ended up focusing and studying terrorism actually for quite a while, which was. Really interesting because at the time I was at university, a terrorist was um, described as in one of two ways. They were either terrorists and bad people, or they were freedom fighters and good people. So there was a pretty fundamental and respectful discourse. It was a good example of actually ways in which people could respectfully disagree. I mean, when you're thinking about people who are terrorists,
Yeah.
trying to then argue that they're in fact freedom fighters, you can elicit some pretty strong reactions from people, especially if they've been directly exposed to that type of violence. But the idea of trying to understand, terrorism from both sides was I think, a most valuable thing I learned at university. Of course, the most valuable thing that I learned at university, like everyone else, was learn how to live by myself and learn how to try and make friends and probably to become bankrupt or broke from having no student grant and spending beyond my means, which I should have learned about in economics, of course.
Yeah.
Um, so and the move from there into communications, um, uh, I was just very curious about how people connect with each other, and so when the idea of applying to a communications firm for a role sprung up, I thought actually that sounds interesting. So
Mhm.
that was my route into it.
And how did you then end up found co-founding um, F, FGS Global in 1994? And of course, it was Finsbury before, and then they had a name change. I mean, I remember when I heard of Finsbury. I mean, it was incredibly dominant, and it just, its sort of trajectory, incredibly impressive run in the industry. So I'd love to know a little bit more about the early days. What led you to co-found? What were the secrets behind the sort of incredible success that it enjoyed?
Well, it was so I was at Brunswick at the time,
Yeah.
and at university I'd been quite entrepreneurial. I was Young Entrepreneur of the Year in 1988 for a business that was designed to basically help me pay my way through university, of course.
Oh.
And so I'd always had this hankering to do things for myself. But Brunswick was a fantastic platform to learn the industry, wonderful colleagues, great clients, really interesting time. And they sponsored. Well, the story was that they sponsored Four Weddings and a Funeral, the premiere of the film. And Alan Parker, the founder of Brunswick at the time, sat me next to Roland Rudd, who was an FT journalist, and he was at the premiere, and we got on very well. Roland then rang me and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing something in the comms area. How about we get together and think that through?" So we met a few times, started to construct what then became Finsbury, and then decided to go for it. I was 27 at the time, 27, 28 at the time. And it seemed like a very exciting thing to do. And importantly, it matched what I was starting to try and make sense of.
Mm.
Because the consulting world is a very fast moving, vibrant place to be. And that's what attracts those of us who are in consulting to be in consulting. But there's a risk that you can become overburdened with clients, and you can end up doing sort of more and more surface type interventions. You can
Yeah.
end up sort of mucking about with headlines and altering a bit of copy.
Very sort of tactical rather
Yeah,
than being able to sort of step back and see the sort of macro perspective of the.
exactly. And I think that that sort of over trading idea, it led me to think with Roland about the idea that wouldn't it be nice? I mean, Roland came at it from a perspective that he found speaking to comms people slightly annoying. They didn't really know their clients well enough, and they tended to be a block. And I sort of found that from my side that I was getting pushed in or pulled in too many directions and not able to really start getting and digging into what a client's strategy was. So
Mm,
we came up with a very simple proposition, which is number one, that we would work with a smaller number of clients per executive,
yeah.
and number two, that we'd all be financially literate, which in the financial PR world, actually, funny enough, wasn't a requirement, which seems rather bizarre when you think about it that way. And that very simple proposition of spending more time on clients and really understanding the numbers gave us an edge. And that's, I think, what gave us our sort of early push and why Finsbury became a really successful business. It's now, of course, merged a number of times with a number of different organizations across different continents, and it's now worth about 1.5 billion. It's been it's 20 something offices all over the world, so it's been a huge success. It's called FGS Global now, and I'm very proud of my role in helping to kick that off. And I think it's a great firm.
How does it feel that you co-founded such an incredible global organization that is, back from 1994? I mean, it's almost like when you have a business, it's almost like having a baby and, so being a proud father. It must feel good.
Yeah, it does feel good. I mean, I think the main thing that I really liked was the amazing people that I got to work with. Because when you run a successful business, lots of really brilliant people come your way, whether they be clients, whether they be colleagues. And I've made great friends. I've thoroughly enjoyed working and learning from some
Yeah.
really very exceptional people. And that's a wonderful privilege in any job.
And how long were you there for before you decided to leave?
So I co-founded it with Roland in 1994, and I left formally for Oxford in 2008. So I was there for 14 years full time. Roland persuaded me to stay on at Finsbury a day a week from 2008. So I remained connected through until 2018, which is when I finally then said, actually, I think it's time to try and have separation between us. At that point, Oxford was becoming really very successful in its own right, and the centre was becoming really quite a leading voice in the world of in the public discourse world around organizations and their responsibilities and how they reacted to crises. And I was finding that it wasn't easy to manage conflicts. So Roland and I agreed that we would that I would cut the ties. And but I remain very friendly with them. The other thing it's been nice to be able to do at Oxford is being able to reconnect with great firms like Brunswick and colleagues who've been to all the other great firms like Teneo and all the others. And so it's been really nice to be able to talk to others in the industry, because the comms industry, is a great fun world with some really, really brilliant people doing super fun work.
Yeah.
And I've really enjoyed reconnecting with people outside of my firm, FGS Global.
So, what was the transition like moving from a fast paced agency life to academia? It's a very different pace, different world. How did you manage that transition? And is it what you expected it to be like?
You're right in lots of ways. First, it's a very different world. It's not fast paced, but it's very intense. So it's a different type of energy required. Secondly, academia is a world where who was it? I think it was Kissinger who said this famous quote, and he of course was an academic as well as a politician and diplomat.
Mm.
And I think he's credited with the rather wonderful phrase or accurate phrase about academia, which is that the problem with academia is that the issues are so great because the stakes are so small. And so sometimes we can find ourselves getting very exercised about very small things. And so that demands a certain energy and intensity as well, which is different from the world of agency. Yes, it's different. I found the transition actually really energizing because in the partnership of Roland and I, Roland has extraordinary connections. He's an incredible raconteur. He's a fantastic front person for the organization, and he's very instinctive and very, very quick like that. My interest was that I was always slightly more interested in trying to understand concepts behind what we were doing. I was trying to put models into the business. I was trying to put some structure and some sense making around how communications professionals go about their work and why and how these things that we do are meaningful. Why does it matter getting a lexicon? Why does it matter if you reshape a narrative this way? What type of themes are connecting and why? So I found the move into academia gave me freedom to start
Mm,
to explore those things in great detail. So the center that I founded back in 2008 is an interdisciplinary center which looks at this question of how do social evaluations like reputation, status, legitimacy, trust, stigma, celebrity, these things, how and why are they important for organizations? And also, how and why do organizations seek to manage them or influence them? And that's something which it was hard to do in agency because you don't have the time to reflect that deeply. You just got to get on with it. You have to get on and solve clients' issues immediately. So in academia, I've had more time to get below the surface.
I think what's also quite interesting is that you also looked at it from different lenses, so finance, legal, ethics, economic perspectives, and so in a way you sort of integrated communications within the fold of a multi-stakeholder lens. And I think that also gives it legitimacy when you're engaging with organizations. I mean, I have a good friend who attended one of the courses, and that's what he really valued about it. Actually, he said to me that he really valued that there was a strong sort of commercial focus rather than just comms metrics for vanity metrics.
I think it also makes enormous sense because when you think about the communications world, there are
Mm,
different ways to think about it. So someone might tell you and I the same thing, and we'll process it differently in our brains
yeah,
because we've come with different backgrounds, different expectations, different norms, maybe different moral codes. And so, understanding psychology is
yeah,
one way to think about communications, which is how do we process information. Then there's
mhm,
the other side, which is how do we make sure information gets properly disseminated amongst, and that's arguably sociology can explain that best, a network science.
yeah,
And then there's behavioral economics, which is how do we indicate that what we're doing is authentic.
yeah.
That's behavioral economics. So this idea of communications as just being a discipline in itself feels to me to be a rather flat representation of what we do. What we should all be doing as consultants is going behind the mechanism of communications into the drivers of how you change belief systems in people's minds. And that could be understanding the brain and psychology. It could be understanding network structures. It could be understanding behavioral economics.
Do you think that in the past we had Edward Bernays, who was obviously the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he therefore, in his practice, there was one of the main pillars was psychology. And when he had a number of his campaigns in the US, he would always have he would always consult with psychologists, and it would be this marriage between psychology and communications. Do you think that actually we sort of lost our way as a profession because we started off there and then actually ended up just becoming increasingly sort of tactical, where public relations became synonymous with media coverage, and we lost our way in terms of the behavioral science and the sociology and the sort of underpinning psychology and neuroscience and actually all those different facets. So what went wrong with our profession?
I think you've put that very well. I mean, when you're trying to engage with understanding, I'd go back to Aristotle. I'd go back to logos, pathos, and ethos. You know,
Yeah.
those foundation stones of how you build connectivity with others and how you engage to shape opinion. It has deep historical tendrils back into psychology, philosophy, if you think of Aristotle, of course,
Mm.
and then all the things that flow from that, whether it be ethics or so yeah, I totally agree with you. I think this idea of focusing on just the mechanism of modern day communications and in particular media relations deeply undersells the profession. The profession is really about trying to help organizations connect to connect with their multiple publics. And that has to be done through multiple different ways, of which media relations is just a part.
And probably because the decline in media, a lot of agencies like myself, we sort of started off predominantly in media relations, and now it's actually a very small part of the work that we do because of the fragmented sort of communication landscape. And consequently, because there's so many channels at play, and and with sort of the data that we now have access to, it's sort of allowed PRs to become more strategic, more macro focused, and almost bringing us back home to our sort of natural origin of psychology, but with the added benefit of data, that sort of bringing these sort of, so bringing public relations into a much more strategic realm, where before. I remember marketing people wouldn't even consult us at the beginning of any campaign, and now, and now increasingly, comms people are having a seat at the table on the board. So there's a sort of a re-emergence now that I see sort of happening in the profession, which I think is quite positive.
Yeah, it
Like,
is. It's absolutely positive, and I think you've spotted it exactly right, which is that we now have harder science. We have more data at our fingertips. Although I
mm,
think sometimes that can be a chimera, and it can be a sort of dangerous thing to pursue because um, where I think communications professionals need to be vigilant is not to become competitive with other data sources. So organizations have many KPIs, and they may be marketing KPIs, finance KPIs, operational KPIs. What I think communications professionals excel at is partnering with the functions to make sure that those business KPIs get delivered most effectively. So, how do you turn a marketing campaign into something that's really authentic and believable? That's a comms addition. How do you turn operational effectiveness into something where people communicate all throughout the supply chain really effectively to resolve issues or be proactive about opportunities? That's communications. And this idea of, I think the communications professionals of today and I hope the future will be critical business partners, not separate entities trying to create separate data streams, separate ways of, justifying their existence. I think that's therein lies madness. I think partly because ultimately no one really cares about how many column inches something produces,
yeah.
or tweets or mentions. It's what that then allows or unlocks in terms of opportunity or protects in terms of downside.
That's fascinating. And another sort of area that sort of underpinned this sort of ongoing change of the profession has been purpose. And so all of a sudden, to engage with stakeholders, to mobilize stakeholders, you have to demonstrate your authentic commitment to whatever your articulated purpose is. And so therefore the vision, mission, values piece that used to just sit, somewhere in a drawer, or, in a barely visited web page of a company website, has now sort of moved sort of center, and and that's very much sort of become the custodians of comms people to ensure that everything is that they sort of close that authenticity gap between espoused values and the sort of the reality. So in a way that they find themselves going into sort of behavior and sort of having to have the guts to sort of speak up to their internal bosses and say, actually, that's not really in line with our values, and that's going to have an impact upon reputation. And I think what a lot of comms people sort of struggle with is how do they build that influence within their organization with their bosses who aren't necessarily comms people and who have always sort of seen them as a slightly sort of tactical, media relations type people. So do you often have those challenges that you explore within your the center?
Yes, and again, I'm really pleased that you've raised this concept of purpose. But to understand purpose, you need to come back to I think stakeholder belief systems.
Yeah.
So the father of modern stakeholder theory was a professor, MIT and various others, called Ed Freeman, who wrote this book in 1984, which has become a sort of stakeholder Bible. And if you think about 1984, that was sort of 15 years into the Milton Friedman era of it's only shareholders that matter. There's an
Yeah.
invisible hand that sits behind shareholders. If you focus on the accountability to this one stakeholder called the shareholder, then everything else will miraculously happen. And I think that was a very appealing notion, of course, because when managers just have one boss, one
Yes.
objective, which is profit, how
Yeah.
much easier is that than trying to manage multiple different stakeholders who are all very persuasive about their particular case? So, to understand purpose, I see purpose as a sense making tool
Mm.
in a stakeholder economy. So, if we have to exist and understand that we exist within ecosystems of stakeholders, how do you make sense of which stakeholder gets which priority at which time?
Mm.
That's where purpose really comes in. And you're right that purpose ought to be a domain led by the corporate affairs professions. And I see that as important because when you look at what purpose should be about, it's about understanding your core DNA, but
Mm.
also understanding how that connects with the society and the needs of society that sit within the ecosystem. The only people on the executive board of a company or in the executive function who understand the outside world
Mm.
are corporate affairs people.
Yeah.
Everyone else is inside out, legal, finance, ops. They all have phenomenal skill sets, but they organize internal systems and they turn them into a projection for outside audiences. The only people that actually decode the outside world in a stakeholder economy and understand what stakeholders actually want are corporate affairs professionals. So corporate affairs professionals should lead the purpose discussions in companies.
So, based upon that thinking, corporate affairs, external perspective, the rest of the functions have the internal sort of lens. Therefore, based upon that, you could argue that corporate affairs professionals, therefore, also will be best placed in terms of identifying risk.
Well, they certainly should play a very important role in identifying externally generated risks, whether that be from politicians becoming too active,
Yeah.
NGOs becoming more vigilant, investors turning against certain themes, etc. And they will translate into or through a lens of reputational harm,
Mm.
legitimacy or illegitimacy, stigma, if you're in the tobacco industry, increasingly investment banking, stigmatized. So lots of different ways in which corporate affairs can make sense of these types of pressures. Yeah, spot on.
And so, with the corporate affairs function, they then therefore are very adept at horizon scanning, spotting risks. But if whilst they're out there looking around, surely they'll also be able to connect the dots and spot opportunities. Because by nature of horizon scanning, you see the threats as well as the opportunities. But yet, the corporate affairs professionals are always sort of tuned into the threats, that could impact reputation. But actually, whilst they're out there, like a meerkat, on behalf of the company, sort of scanning, the savannah, actually they're very well placed for opportunities.
Yeah, again, spot on. I mean, I think the reason why corporate affairs is most associated with risk reputationally is because they get put in as firefighters whenever there's a problem. They get called in when there's a crisis. They get called in when there's an unfavorable media thing. They get called in. So there's a sort of automatic association of firefighting and corporate affairs. But
Yeah.
if you think about the discussion we've just had, where the best corporate affairs directors of today and tomorrow, I argue, will become this Pentium chip, this Intel Inside function, where they
Mm.
partner with the different functions inside a business, that will be as much about, if not more about, unlocking opportunities than it is about protecting risk. So, partnering with the supply chain to say, how do we get people to work much more effectively down the supply chain to try and improve productivity? So, think about an example I uncovered a while back is in the long production lines in the glass making industry. In the glassmaking industry, the production line is close to a mile long, right? For these sheet glass bits. So people spread across this very long production line can sometimes not even come across each other. And when they're coming up with some issues or problems or ideas about how to improve the productivity or the timeliness, these things can get lost very easily. So communications and building platforms for these people to come together, become these teams that then are sort of critical incident teams thinking about how they can improve productivity. These things can really make a difference. And that's a corporate affairs and communications addition to an operational teams type of plan.
I never thought about that, but there's tremendous value to unlock there, where you sort of replace the friction with fluidity, so
Yeah.
the organization information flows much better. Now, I wanted to understand a little bit about, you've got the Center for Corporate Reputation that you founded in 2008, and then you have the Corporate Affairs Academy. So how do they operate in relation to each other?
And just so we cover them all, the enacting purpose initiative as well. So
Yeah,
uh,
how do the three of them
how
sort
does
of
it work? So the centre for
Mhm.
reputation is my academic home. That's where we have a research focus. 75% of our work is about production of new insights through detailed academic research. So we have research fellows who work there. They research particular themes, legitimacy, status, stigma, etc., and they produce papers which are published papers in academic journals.
And can I ask, these reports that they issue, do you have sort of an annual report on a particular theme, or are the themes sort of depending upon what the sort of the academics are writing? I mean, do you have like a every year? Edelman does like a trust barometer, for instance. Others do sort of focus on risk. Is your centre sort of famous for some key themes, and are they sort of one offs, or do you have like an annual sort of report on those themes?
So we are famous for certain key insights. So
Right.
number one, we're famous for, and these are now called sort of Oxford views now, which is that we're famous for, first of all, that reputations are not singular. They're
Okay.
plural. So people talk about reputation, and we always challenge that to say, well, it depends what reputation you're talking about.
Mm.
Reputations are for something with someone. They're dimensional and they're audience specific. And we were the first to really encapsulate that properly and make that a very distinctive feature of our research work. We're known for pulling together others' work and contributing ourselves to what I think has become a very powerful diagnostic now, which is this dual dimensionality of social evaluation and, in particular, reputation. And that's this idea that we all have two lenses through which we evaluate others. The first
Mm.
is this lens of capability. Do I think they're good at what they do? Are they good lawyers? Do they make good t-shirts? Are they a good financial institution?
So
And that's about, yeah, it's the competence, exactly. Capability, competence. The other lens is character, which has got nothing to do with whether you're good at what you do, but what can I expect in my interaction with you, either as an employee or as an investor or as a customer? What sort of interaction am I going to have with you? So if you think about VW and the emissions scandal, VW, great cars, capability. In fact, arguably, 9 years of defeat devices means they've got even more capability and a higher perception of their capability than they should have, right?
Mm.
But their character, their corporate character, definitely slightly problematic. Amazon, we all love Amazon, but we all love to hate Amazon. Again, capability, character. So there's that super useful diagnostic between these perceptions then really helps you to try and parse out what to do about these. If it's character, normally the restitution is governance. If it's
Yeah.
capability, you've got to fix the product. So it helps you think not only about how these things are perceived and who cares, but also what you've got to do to fix them. So those two critical insights, and then the third, I guess, main thing is that we've got these three drivers that we talk about. So how do you engage to influence your reputation? Because you don't own it. your reputation is not owned by you, it's owned by others. So how do you influence your reputation, not control it or manage it? People talk about managing reputation all the time. We dismiss that as a very, very unhelpful idea. And so we've articulated fairly consistently, including in the book, this idea that there are three lenses. So the first is your behaviors, which send behavioral signals. The second are the network structures that you create, either network closure or network openness. And the third is your narrative styles and structures. So those three influence strategies have also become synonymous with our center. So that's the center. That's the research engine. In the center also is some policy work, but I'm going to pause on that because if we now go to the Corporate Affairs Academy has got nothing to do with research.
Mm-hmm.
It's about translating research into insight and practice. So that's an executive program for corporate affairs directors who will sit and engage with the research work done from the centre and elsewhere in Oxford, psychology, philosophy, economics, law, others. And they will learn from that in a focused way as to how those themes influence their professional activities. And the Enacting Purpose Initiative is designed to be both a research and an impact engine. So we write white papers and policy papers, which we put into government and other different EU and US and other World Bank regulatory bodies to try and shape the public discourse on key subjects. In our case, it's purpose, but white papers get written on everything. So that combination of research, education, and impact are the three things that we do.
That's brilliant. So when executives come to learn at the Corporate Affairs Academy, what they're really doing is benefiting from all of the research and the thinking that has been ongoing at the Centre for Corporate Reputation since 2008. And then you also are not only feeding that into the sort of the private sector, because most of your executives tend to come from sort of corporates, but you're also have your research that you're then feeding into government and policymakers. So that's absolutely fascinating. What came first, the Corporate Affairs Academy or the impact?
The Enacting Purpose. So the Corporate Affairs Academy, so the centre came first, and the year later I set up the Corporate Affairs Academy. So the first Corporate Affairs Academy happened 18 months after the establishment of the centre. The Enacting Purpose Initiative was set up in 2019. So
relatively recently.
Much more recent, yeah.
Right. And so I think you broke down reputation in such an interesting way, because it always sort of feels quite sort of ambiguous, and just breaking it down into sort of two sort of buckets of capability and character. Because sometimes I come across somebody and I think, God, that'd be fantastic to work with, but actually I just don't like their value system. And then others are like, well, I really like that person, but I don't think they could do the job. And so it's quite interesting because I'm sure people have different sort of levers in terms of some people are really happy to work with people, but because if they can do the job, if they've got the competence, and they don't mind if they don't particularly like them, and for others it's the others.
Yeah, I think that's really, really valuable. It's exactly right. And it translates into corporate culture. There are some corporate cultures where that type of, look, we just want the best, but they're not great cultures, or they're mercenary cultures. There's a great paper written in 1996, which is still a great paper, which splits corporate cultures into sociability and solidarity. Are you high or low sociability, high or low solidarity? And one of the low sociability, high solidarity quadrant is mercenary organizations. That's the ones where you just hire the very best people and you don't really care too much about whether they're nice. And then you've got this sort of collaborative organizations up in the top right, highly sociable, and they're sort of networked or collaborative organizations like Unilever's, and they are just sort of different cultures, right? So I think your point about capability and character translating to corporate culture is really spot on.
And that probably also has a link with staff turnover.
It can do, yeah. I mean, some people, of course, like working in mercenary environments because they're paid.
Yeah, it's about alignment of values, really. I guess it's that's absolutely fascinating. So the incredible reports that you issue in the policy papers and the white papers, are all of them sort of, are they gated, or actually do you have content that our listeners can go onto the website and download and actually read some of the reports?
So the beauty of a public institution like Oxford is everything is open to the public.
That's
Um,
fantastic.
and so the majority of our research does not sit behind paywalls. There are some journals that have paywalls where they charge for access to articles, but on the whole, we've got the ability to make what we do public. We also publish case studies, and unlike Harvard, who charges $1 a page, we make them freely available all over the world to institutions from all over the world, which is really important because it means that institutions that don't have the money and the wealth that some of the Western institutions have can actually work with some really well structured case studies to help people understand phenomena around the world. So
Yeah.
our case studies are downloaded in around 60, 70 countries around the world, which otherwise wouldn't be able to have access to some of the more expensive stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
almost universally publicly available.
That's a huge service to the industry. Do you feel that over the years that you've been at Oxford since 2008, the world of sort of practicing, communications and academia has actually come a bit closer together, or do you think actually we're still quite far apart? And
Another great question. I mean, I don't know, but all I can say is that we're doing our best to try and bring these worlds closer. We are, I think, one of the very few places, if not the only place, that really tries to celebrate bringing structure into a profession which is known for its brilliant ability to be instinctive. And that's also a huge strength, by the way. But we are celebrated, I think, for trying to put a bit of structure and a bit of peer-reviewed thinking behind some of those instinctive decisions that you all make. Um,
yeah,
and increasingly, we find corporate affairs directors really like that because the instinctive side is great, but someone at some point in their senior leadership team will challenge it and say, "That's just your opinion. My opinion's different." And when they can say, "It may be my opinion, but it's backed up by research," it gives them an edge.
and the reports that you have in the courses, are they mainly for sort of in-house corporate affairs directors, or actually could it also help and benefit agency people working in?
It's actually a really important question, which we ought to think about much more proactively. Currently, we just make it available for in-house, and we
Yeah,
don't allow agencies onto that in-house focus because we can't risk people then starting to cross-sell or whatever. And it's a sort of safe space, if you like, a sort of AA safe space for corporate affairs directors not to be pitched by corporate affairs people. But I think there is a huge open and need for exactly the same thinking to be delivered and to be engaged with the agencies. And I spent a lot of my time being invited in, and I like doing this, coming and talking to agency people about some of the findings that we have.
yeah.
Um, the skill sets are
Mm,
identical from in-house well, not identical, but very, very big crossover.
yeah.
And I certainly love working with the agency people too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something to think about because actually a lot of agencies that are working internationally, for instance, in the Middle East, a lot of their work also is capacity building.
Mm. Yeah.
And so, in a way, it sort of blurs between sort of agency and and building capacity in client organizations, where often members of the team are on site, and especially a lot of that's happening in Saudi, Qatar, and other countries. So that's definitely something worthwhile thinking about. Now, what I wanted to ask is a little bit about your um, the boards that you sit on. Now, what we find is a lot of comms professionals are really struggling to have their voice heard by senior leadership team. You often see CMOs sitting on the board, and chief communication officers, corporate affairs directors, etc. They want to be able to add their voice because, of course, we now live in a world of stakeholder capitalism where it's not just about profit but also about planet and people. And with the whole ESG lens, a lot of in-house, they want to see themselves, or somebody that has their voice as a not as a NED, as a non-executive director. You've obviously been on boards. You advise a number of boards. What advice would you give to listeners who want to build a portfolio career, to sit on boards, advise on boards, or even people who just want to be able to influence senior stakeholders?
So the first thing is be careful what you wish for, because sitting on boards comes with liabilities. It comes with an a huge amount of commitment. You have to read and understand some really complex things sometimes, and it takes quite a long time. And of course, you're reputationally responsible or liable for a lot of what happens. So think very carefully before you accept. Um,
Mhm.
the the issue for corporate affairs people on boards is that there are very few slots on boards which are available for generalists.
Mm.
And so the competition is very high. There are some very good examples of corporate affairs directors who have managed to secure really good, high profile senior publicly listed boards. And they've made a huge difference, I think, on these boards because they help decode the outside in. Um,
Mm.
but their number is few, and they tend to be women because the availability of slots, they still, sadly, we have too many men on boards, not enough women on boards, and so the slot being given or available to corporate affairs directors, there are some exceptional corporate affairs directors who are women, and they will often get the slot over their otherwise exceptional male colleagues. So it's difficult to get in. For those who want to do it, I mean, I think that there are ways to do it which is outside of the public company space, which is, I think, much more tricky. So in private companies, there's many, many more opportunities to engage. Some of these businesses are huge. They're very, very complex. For example, I sit on one at the minute, which is a charity board, which is the Halo Trust. And the Halo Trust is its annual budget, its annual spend is around 190 million currently. It's got 11,000 people operating in 26 countries all over the world. So this board, the trustee board of 12 people, is in charge of that, and that would be a FTSE 100 business if it was a listed company.
Significant.
So the ability to get onto charitable boards, private company boards, take any opportunity you can. In my experience, when you sit on these boards, it exposes you again, if you're curious and you listen, it exposes you to different thinking, different challenges, different ways of solving things. I've learned an enormous amount from sitting on boards. So think broadly, definitely go for it, but be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, and always try and ensure that there's adequate insurance for directors and officers and NEDs. Uh,
Yes, for sure.
so I'm listening to your book on Spotify, The Reputation Game. I'm going to go on to the Activist Manifesto, but I'm really interested about this third book that you are currently writing, where you're exploring the dark triad, so characteristics of narcissism, Machiavellian, and sort of psychopathy. What on earth drew you to this subject?
Well, thank you for asking about it. It's now finished and submitted, so that's I'm feeling pleased about it. This is a book. It's provisionally called Forked Tongues, and it deals with
Great name, Rupert. I love that.
yeah. I actually credit my agent rather than me with the name of that.
Well done, agent.
And But it's a book which seeks to try and understand the phenomenon of people who seek to tear you down. So, who are these bad people? Who are these people who ultimately are interested in destroying you? Now, we're exposed to that today because of the very vicious and sort of discourse that happens online these days, where people seek to tear people down online. But actually, it's got a very long tail, where people have sought to undermine the credibility of others forever. So I go back to Cicero and his incredible oratories where he eviscerated his political opponents. You go through the Middle Ages, the courts where a silent whisper in someone's ears would destroy your family and your career, through to the polite societies of 18th, 19th century Britain, and then the emerging Americas, where everything was around the gossip that others said about you, through to political warfare executive in the Second World War, who deployed on behalf of the British people some extraordinarily vicious undermining tactics against Nazi generals to try and undermine their credibility with Hitler. So this has got a huge, long history to it. And I felt it was just super interesting in today's rather vile discourse online to come and take a look at this question. And what was really interesting in the book, in studying this, is that it got me into reading psychology. And I'm not a psychologist, so reading psychology in that level of detail was challenging, for
Yeah.
sure. But what started to emerge is that most of psychology deals with personality indices on a
Hmm.
straight line, negative personality indices to positive indices. And that struck me as being not right. I couldn't quite work out that bad people were just the opposite of good people. It just
Yeah.
felt to me that bad people are very different. There's something that makes them malicious, and it
Mm.
gives them some different psychological profile. And so I talked to a colleague at Worcester College, which is my college at Oxford, who's a psychologist, experimental psychologist, called Professor Paul Azzopardi, who said, if you're trying to make sense of this, have a look at the dark triad. And the dark triad was exactly as you say. It's these three personality traits that scholars in the field since 2002 have started to separate out and say these people are just different. They do different things. Their brains are hardwired to do different things. And those three are exactly as you said, it's narcissists, Machiavellians, and psychopaths. So the book is anchored around who are those types, some examples of the types of people we see today or in history. And then the second half of the book is how do you protect against those people in today's world?
I mean, it's so timely with because they've always existed, and the fact that they continue to exist in our society means that they there's a evolutionary benefit to having those characteristics. And often I find it's quite interesting how those characteristics, because of the lack of empathy, they can make very difficult decisions that often lend itself to to very sort of senior positions in organizations, be it in politics or business.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people will take a look at those three characteristics, and if they think about them carefully, they'll probably identify the majority of the FTSE 100 as having at least one of those traits in
Yeah,
terms of the CEOs of these big businesses, because some of these leaders, they need to be able to operate at that level of distance from some of the emotional characteristics that maybe those of us not in those positions aren't
yeah.
subject to.
Do you have a section on how to spot them? Because I'm sure there's some who are very good at sort of masking these. Because I think that these sort of characteristics emerge, when they're quite young. They sort of realize that actually this is socially acceptable to say this, or to to demonstrate this is how they think or view things. So the sort of masking then makes it quite difficult to identify.
It does, and yes, the answer is that that the first section I specifically pull out the particular characteristics that sit within them. So when you spot recklessness or callousness, that you can start to attribute those. So I put it in that frame, and in fact within the book I've also got you can go into your own personality questionnaire, and you can then come up with your own personality set of disorders and to see where you sit on the scale, which is kind of interesting when you do it, because you start to realize that it's not about a sense of these are other people who are just sitting over there and then we're all the good people. We're all of us minor character assassins in our lives. We love a good gossip. We love tearing down
Yes,
somebody.
yeah,
So
I admit.
so there's a self-reflective, and it brings us back to the start of our conversation, which is that I guess what I haven't really thought about it this way, but I guess part of the reason to write this was because I'm interested in trying to break down these silos around otherness. We are all of us little mini character assassins. And so to think of this as just being a book about other people, I think misses the point. Um,
Yeah, and we all have our shadow side, whether we choose to
yeah.
admit it or not.
Yeah.
Now, what communicator do you admire the most, past or present?
So, well, someone I admire for their ability to connect, which I guess is probably the best definition of a communicator.
Hmm.
And I've admired her forever. Is the poet and essayist Maya Angelou, who's just been an incredible inspiration. When you read what she writes about inequality and inequity, obviously through a racial inequity lens,
Yeah,
but more generally around the power of being human and the power of starting as human first and then segregated in any form second. I've admired that and I like that. So I guess she'd be my communications hero.
yeah. She is incredibly empowering, and still I rise. You hear about her sort of resilience that comes through repetition of, and still I rise. Thinkers. authors, podcasts, poets, philosophers who've had the most impact. And I imagine, judging by your bookshelf and the fact that you chose to devote your life to academia, you've probably read an awful lot. So, which ones in particular do you feel have sort of shaped the way that you think about reputation, about communication, about connecting?
Well, am I allowed to give more than one?
Yes, and you could even mention your own book.
No, I won't mention that. But I think the things that have expanded my mind at a rapid rates of knots, uh,
Mhm.
I would say first of all is the network science stuff, the stuff around sociology and how networks are formed, closed and open networks. And there's a wonderful writer and scholar called Ron Burt, and I really enjoy reading his books and his work. So I think he's someone who I like. Daniel Kahneman I like as well, because he thinks about these systems and the system one, system two. So that's a sort of way in which we process things,
Mhm.
which I quite like. So I think he'd be someone who I would bring on my intellectual desert island. But I'm at risk of sounding really quite boring and geeky, and I'm probably not. Well, I maybe I am. I probably am, but I think the author I would probably most enjoy reading, and I certainly have all his books, is Paul Auster, the American novelist and short story writer. And I just think the way he simplifies and connects very complex things in such an easy way, I really enjoy his work. So Paul Auster.
That's wonderful. And the penultimate question: what career advice would you give to your younger self?
Be more curious earlier in your life. Um, uh, be on receive, not transmit. God gave you two ears and one mouth. Use it in that order.
Love it. Absolutely love it. And the final question: how do you stay sane? So, mental health and well-being hacks. What sort of keeps you feeling grounded? And you've got lots of plates spinning.
Um, the answer's behind you on the sofa. I have a dog. I also have a family, so family life and the simplicity and the love that comes from your animals and pets. It never fails to remind you of just what's important.
I agree 100%. Thank you, Rupert, for such a fascinating conversation and for sharing your journey with our listeners. And thank you for listening. You'll find this episode on PRCA's YouTube channel, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, alongside other episodes that my co host Dan Gold and I have interviewed in the past. If you like what you hear, please do share so we can grow our community. If you have any feedbacks or topics, please do get in contact. We publish interviews every 2 weeks, so stay tuned. We have some incredible stories in the pipeline.